History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4, The Age of Divergent Tradition. Chapter 6, India. The Kushana period brought fresh foreign influences once more into Indian culture, often from the West, as the Hellenistic flavor of its sculpture, particularly of Buddha, shows. It marks an epoch in another way, for the depicting of the Buddha was something of an innovation in Kushan times. The Kushanas carried it very far, and the Greek models gradually gave way to the forms of Buddha familiar today. This was one expression of the developing complexity of Buddhist religion. One thing which was happening was that Buddhism was being popularized and materialized. Buddha was turning into a god, but this was only one among many charges. Millenarianism, more emotional expressions of religion, and more sophisticated philosophical systems were all interplaying with one another. To distinguish Hindu or Buddhist, orthodoxy in this is somewhat artificial. In the end, the Kushanas succumbed to a greater power. Bactria and the Kabul Valley were taken by Artaxerxes early in the 3rd century AD. Soon after, another Sassanid king took the Kushana capital of Peshawar, and such statements make it easy to feel impatient with the narrative they provide. Contemplating them, the reader may well feel with Voltaire. What is it to me if one king replaces another on the banks of the Oxus and Jayaxarth? It is like the fratricidal struggles of Frankish kings or of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the Heptarchy on a slightly larger scale. It is indeed difficult to see much significance in this ebb and flow beyond its registration of the two great constants of Indian history: the importance of the northwestern frontier as a cultural conduit and the digestive power of Hindu civilization. None of the invading peoples could, in the end, resist the assimilative power India always showed. New rulers were before long ruling Hindu kingdoms, whose roots went back, possibly beyond Maurya times, to political units of the 4th and 5th centuries BC, and adopting Indian ways. Invaders never penetrated far to the south. After the Maurya breakup, the Deccan long remained separate and under its own Dravidian rulers. Its cultural distinction persists even today, though Aryan influence was stronger there after the Maurya era, and Hinduism and Buddhism were never to disappear. The South was not again truly integrated politically with the North until the coming of the British Raj. In this confusing period, not all India's contacts with outsiders were violent. Trade with Roman merchants grew so visibly that Pliny blamed it wrongly for draining gold out of the empire. We have little hard information. It is true except about the arrival of embassies from India to negotiate over trade, but the remark suggests that one feature of India's trade with the West was already established. What Mediterranean market sought were luxuries which only India could supply, and there was little they could offer in return except bullion. This pattern held until the 19th century. There are also other interesting signs of intercontinental contacts arising from trade. The sea is a uniter of cultures of trading communities. Tamil words for commodities turn up in Greek, and Indians from the south had traded with Egypt since Hellenistic times. Later, Roman merchants lived in the southern ports where Tamil kings kept Roman bodyguards. Finally, it seems likely that whatever the truth may be about the Holy Apostle Thomas, Christianity appeared in India first in the western trading ports, possibly as early as the 1st century AD. Political unity did not appear again even in the north until hundreds of years had passed. A new Ganges Valley state, the Gupta Empire, was then the legatee of 5 centuries of confusion. Its center was at Patna, where a dynasty of Gupta emperors established itself. The first of these, another Chandragupta, began to reign in 320, and within 100 years, North India was once more for a time united and relieved of external pressure and incursion. It was not so an empire as Ashoka's, but the Guptas preserved there longer. For some 2 centuries, North India enjoyed under them a sort of an Antonine age, later to be imagined with nostalgia, India's classical period. The Gupta age brought the first great consolidation of an Indian art. From the earlier times, little has survived before the perfection of stone carving under the Mauryas. The columns, which are its monuments, were the culmination of a native tradition of stonework. For a long time, stone carving and the building still showed traces of styles evolved in an age of wood construction, but techniques were well advanced before the arrival of Greek influence, once thought to be the origin of Indian stone sculpture. What the Greeks brought were new artistic motifs and techniques from the West. If we are to judge by what survives, the major deployment of these influences was found in the Buddhist culture until well into the Christian era. But before the Gupta era, a rich and indigenous tradition of Hindu sculpture had also been established, and from this time, India's artistic life is mature and self sustaining. In Gupta times, there began to be built the great numbers of stone temples, as distinct from excavated and embellished caves, which are the great glories both of Indian art and architecture before the Muslim era. Gupta civilization was also remarkable for its literacy achievement. Again, the roots are deep. The standardization and the systematization of Sanskrit grammar just before Maurya times opened the path to a literature which could be shared by the elite of the whole subcontinent. Sanskrit was a tie uniting North and South in spite of their cultural differences. The great epics were given their classical form in Sanskrit, though they were also available in translations into local languages, and in it wrote the greatest of Indian poets, Kalidasa. He was also dramatist, and in the Gupta era, there emerged from the shadowy past the Indian theatre, whose traditions have been maintained and carried into the popular Indian film industry of the 20th century. Intellectually, too, the Gupta era was a great one. It was in the 5th century that Indian arithmeticians invented the decimal system. A layman can perhaps glimpse the importance of this more readily than he can that of the Indian philosophical resurgence of the same period. The resurgence was not confined to religious thought, but what can be gathered from it about general attitudes or the direction of culture seems highly debatable. In a literary text such as the Kama Sutra, a Western observer may be most struck by the prominence given in it to the acquisition of techniques whose use, however stimulating to the individual, can at most have absorbed only a small fraction of interest and the time of a tiny elite. A negative point is perhaps safest. Neither the emphasis on dharma of the Brahmanical tradition, nor the ascetic severities of some Indian teachers, nor the frank acceptance of sensual pleasure suggested by many texts beside the Kama Sutra have anything in common with the striving, militant Puritanism so strong in both the Christian and Islamic traditions. Indian civilization moved to very different rhythms from those further west. Here perhaps lay its deepest strength and the explanation of its powers of resistance to alien cultures. In the Gupta era, Indian civilization came to its mature classical form. Chronologically derived from politics is the hindrance here. Important developments flow across the boundaries of any arbitrary period. Nevertheless, in Gupta culture, we can sense the presence of a fully evolved Hindu society. Its outstanding expression was a caste system which by then had come to overlay and complicate the original four-class division of Vedic society. Within castes which locked them into well defined groups for marriage and usually to their occupations. Most Indians lived a life close to the land. The cities were, for the most part, great markets or great centers of pilgrimage. Most Indians were, as they are now, peasants, whose lives were lived within the assumptions of religious culture already set in its fundamental form in pre Maurya times. Some of its later developments have been mentioned already. Others run on past the Gupta period and will have to be discussed elsewhere. Of their vigor and power, there can be no doubt, with centuries of further elaboration ahead. They were already expressed in Gupta times in a huge development of carving and sculpture which manifest the power of popular religion and take their place alongside the stupas and Buddhas of pre-Gupta times as an enduring feature of the Indian landscape. Paradoxically, India, largely because of its religious art, is a country where we have perhaps more evidence about the mind of men of the past than we have about their material life. We may know little about the precise way in which Gupta taxation actually weighed on the peasant, though we can guess. But in the contemplation of the endless dance of the gods and demons, the forming and dissolving patterns of animal and symbols, we can touch a world still alive and visible in the village shrines and juggernauts of our own day. In India, as nowhere else, there is some chance of access to life of the uncounted millions whose history should be recounted in such books as this, but which usually escapes us. In the climax of Hindu civilization between Gupta times and the coming of Islam, the fertility of Indian religion, the soil of Indian culture, was hardly troubled by political change. One symptom was the appearance by 600 or thereabouts of an important new cult which quickly took a place it was never to lose in Hindu worship, that of the mother goddess Devi. Some have seen in her an expression of a new sexual emphasis which marked both Hinduism and Buddhism. Her cult was part of a general effervescence of religious life, lasting a couple of centuries or more, for a new popular emotionalism is associated with the cults of Shiva and Vishnu at about the same time. Dates are not very helpful here. We have to think of counting change during the whole of the centuries corresponding to those of early Christian era, whose result was the final evolution of the old Brahmanical religion into Hinduism. From it, there emerged a spectrum of practice and belief offering something for all needs. It ran from the philosophic system of Vedanti, an abstract creed stressing the unreality of the factual and material and the desirability of winning disengagement from it in true knowledge of reality. Brahma, to the crudities of the village shrines at which local deities were worshipped, which had been easily assimilated to the cults of Shiva or Vishnu by the belief that these two leading deities might appear in more than one incarnation. Religious effervescence thus found expression antithetically in the simultaneous growth of image worship and the rise of new austerity. Animal sacrifice had never stopped. It was one of the things now endorsed by a new strictness of conservative religious practice. So was a new rigidity of attitudes towards women and their intensified subordination. The religious expression of this was an upsurge of child marriage and the practice called sati or self-immolation of widows on their husband's funeral pyres. Yet, the richness of Indian culture is such that this coercioning of religion was accompanied also by the development to their highest pitch of the philosophical tradition of the Vedanti, the culmination of Vedic tradition, and the new development of Mahayana Buddhism, which asserted the divinity of the Buddha. The roots of the latter went back to the early deviations from the Buddha's teaching on contemplation, purity, and non attachment. These deviations had favored a more ritualistic and popular religious approach and also stressed a new interpretation of the Buddha's role. Instead of merely being understood as a teacher and an example, Buddha was now seen as the greatest of bodhisattvas, saviors who entitled to the bliss of self annihilation themselves, nevertheless rejected it to remain in the world and teach men the way to salvation. To become a bodhisattva gradually became the aim of many Buddhists. In part, the efforts of a Buddhist council summoned by the Kushan ruler Kanishka had been directed towards reintegrating two tendencies in Buddhism, which were increasingly divergent. This had not been successful. Mahayana Buddhism, the word means great vehicle, focused upon a Buddha who was effectively a divine savior who might be worshipped and followed in faith. One manifestation of great single heavenly Buddha who begins to look somewhat like the undifferentiated soul behind all things found in Hinduism. The disciplines of austerity and contemplation Gautama had taught were now increasingly confined to a minority of Orthodox Buddhists, the followers of Mahayana, winning conversions among the masses. One sign of this was the proliferation in the 1st and 2nd century ADs of statues and representations of Buddha, a practice hitherto restrained by the Buddha's prohibition of idol worships. Mahayana Buddhism eventually replaced earlier forms in India and spread also along the Central Asian routes through Central Asia to China and Japan. The more orthodox tradition did better in Southeastern Asia and Indonesia. Hinduism and Buddhism were thus both marked by changes which broadened their appeal. The Hindu religion prospered better, though there is a regional factor at work here. Since Kushan times, the center of Indian Buddhism had been the northwest, the region most exposed to the devastations of Hun raiders. Hinduism prospered most in the south. Both the northwest and the south, of course, were zones where cultural currents intermingled most easily with those from the classical Mediterranean world, in the one across land and in the other by sea. These changes provoked a sense of culmination and climax. They matured only shortly before Islam arrived in the subcontinent, but early enough for a philosophical outlook to have solidified, one which has marked India ever since and has shown astonishing invulnerability to competing views. At its heart was a vision of endless cycles of creation and reabsorption into the divine, a picture of the cosmos which predicated a cyclic and not a linear history. What difference this made to the way Indians have actually behaved, right down to the present day, is a huge subject and almost impossible to grasp. It might be expected to lead to passivity and skepticism about the value of practical action, yet this is very debatable. Few Christians lived lives wholly coherent with their beliefs, and there is no reason to expect Hindus to be more consistent. The practical activity of sacrifice and propitiation in Indian temples survives still. Yet the direction of a whole culture may nonetheless be determined by the emphasis of its distinctive modes of thought, and it is difficult not to feel that much of India's history has been determined by a world outlook which stressed the limits rather than the potential of human action. For the background to Islam in India, we have to return to 500 or so. From about that time, northern India was once again divided in obedience both to the centrifugal tendencies which afflicted early empires and to the appearance of a mysterious invasion of Hunas. Were they perhaps Huns? Certainly, they behaved like them, devastating much of the northwest, sweeping away many of the established ruling families. Across the mountains in Afghanistan, they mortally wounded Buddhism, which has been strongly established there. In the subcontinent itself, this anarchic period did less fundamental damage, though the northern plains had broken up again into warring kingdoms. Indian cities do not seem to have been much disturbed, and peasant life recovers quickly from but the worst blows. Indian warfare appears rapidly to have acquired important and effective conventional limits on its potential for destructiveness. The state of affairs over much of North at this time seems in some ways rather like that of some European countries during the more anarchic periods of Middle Ages, when feudal relationships more or less kept the peace between potentially competitive grandees and could not completely contain outbreaks of violence, which were essentially about different forms of tribute. Meanwhile, Islam had come to India. It did so first through Arab traders on the western coasts. Then, in 712 or thereabouts, Arab armies conquered Sindh. They got no further, gradually settled down, and ceased to trouble the Indian peoples. A period of calm followed, which lasted until the Ghaznavid ruler broke deep into India early in the 11th century with raids which were destructive, but again did not produce radical change. Indian religious life for another 2 centuries moved still to its own rhythms, the most striking changes being the decline of Buddhism and the rise of Tantrism, a semi magical and superstitious growth of practices promising access to holiness by charms and ritual. Cults centered on popular festivals at temples also prospered, no doubt in the absence of a strong political focus in post Gupta times. Then came a new invasion of Central Asians. These invaders were Muslims and were drawn from the complex of Turkish peoples. Theirs was a different sort of Islamic onslaught from earlier ones, for they came to stay, not just to raid. They first established themselves in the Punjab in the 11th century and then launched a second wave of invasions at the end of the 12th century, which led within a few decades to the establishment of Turkish sultans at Delhi, who ruled the whole of the Ganges Valley. Their empire was not monolithic. Hindu kingdoms survived within it on a tributary basis, as Christian kingdoms survived to be tributaries of Mongols in the west. The Muslim rulers, perhaps careful of their material interests, did not always support their co religionists of the ulama who sought to proselytize and were willing to persecute, as the destruction of Hindu temples shows. The heartland of first Muslim empire in India was the Ganges Valley. The invaders rapidly overran Bengal and later established themselves on the west coast of India and the tableland of the Deccan. Further south, they did not penetrate and Hindu society survived there largely unchanged. In any case, their rule was not to last long even in the north. In 1398, Timur Lang's army sacked Delhi after a devastating approach march, which was made all the speedier, said one chronicler, because of the Mongols' desire to escape from the stench of decay arising from the piles of corpses they left in the wake. In the troubled waters after this disaster, generals and local potentates struck out for themselves and Islamic India fragmented again. Nonetheless, Islam was by now established in the subcontinent. The greatest challenge yet seen to India's assimilation powers for its active prophetic revelatory style was wholly antithetical both to Hinduism and Buddhism, though Islam too was to be subtly changed by them. New sultans emerged at Delhi but showed no power to restore the former Islamic empire. Only in the 16th century was it revived by a prince from outside, Babur of Kabul. On his father's side, he descended from Timur, and on his mother's from Chinggis. Formidable advantages and a source of inspiration to a young man schooled in adversity. He quickly discovered he had to fight for his inheritance, and there can have been few monarchs who, like Babur, conquered a city of the importance of Samarkand at the age of 14, albeit to lose it again almost at once. Even when legend and anecdote are separate, he remains, in spite of cruelty and duplicity, one of the most attractive figures among the great rulers. Munificent, hardy, courageous, intelligent, and sensitive, he left a remarkable autobiography written from the notes made throughout his life, which was to be treasured by his descendants as a source of inspiration and guidance. It displays a ruler who did not think of himself as Mongol in culture, but Turkish in the tradition of whose peoples long settled in the former eastern provinces of the Abbasid Caliphate. His taste and culture were formed by the inheritance of Timurid princes of Persia. His love of gardening and poetry came from the country and fitted easily into the setting of an Islamic India whose courts were already much influenced by Persian models. Babur was a bibliophile, another Timurid trait. It is reported that when he took Lahore, he went at once to his defeated adversary's library to choose texts from it to send as gifts to his sons. He himself wrote, among other things, a 40-page account of his conquests in Hindustan, noting its customs and caste structure and, even more minutely, its wildlife and flowers. This young prince was called into India by Afghan chiefs, but had his own claims to make to his inheritance of the Timurid line in Hindustan. This was to prove the beginning of the Mughal India. Mughal was the Persian word for Mongol, though it was not a word Babur applied to himself. Originally, those whose discontent and intrigue called him forward had only aroused in him the ambition of conquering Punjab, but he was soon drawn further. In 1526, he took Delhi after the Sultan had fallen in battle. Soon Babur was subduing those who had invited him to come to India, while at the same time conquering the infidel Hindu princes who had seized an opportunity to renew their own independence. The result was an empire which, in 1530, the year of his death, stretched from Kabul to the borders of Bihar. Babur's body significantly was taken as he directed to Kabul, where it was buried in his favorite garden with no roof over his tomb, in the place he had always thought of as home.